Welcome to Call Your Coven, practical advice for nonsensical times. I'm Jeanna Kadlec, and I am the Coven's resident astrologer. I am so excited to be getting to meet you on my own. While my own solo astrology episodes will cover a wide range, from the educational astrology to 101 to topics like presidential astrology, which we are coming up on very soon. This first episode is a dedicated primer for beginners on the nature of the planets and the signs. So, if you would like a refresher, or if you're an experienced astrology student who is just curious about my approach, you are absolutely welcome here. But just bear in mind that I'm not going to be getting super in the weeds with technicalities. Today, we are going to be talking about the meaning of the planets and of the signs, and we'll also talk about how we get there, especially with the signs. How do we develop meanings for example, having your sun in Virgo? It is Virgo season right now, after all. If none of that made sense to you, that is totally okay. You are doing great. You're here. You're not supposed to know anything already. That's what I'm for. I've got you. So, if you listened to our intro episode, Meg's and Bee's and my introductions to ourselves, to our modalities, and also just to how we got into doing this incredibly fulfilling and very weird work, then you already know a bit about me and my approach to astrology. But just to share a little about myself, in case this is the first episode you're tuning into, I am a writer, and I specialize in working with other writers and creatives. My newsletter is called Astrology for Writers. It's on Substack under my name, so you can check it out there. I'm working on multiple book projects right now, and my first book, a memoir called Heretic, came out in 2022 with HarperCollins. I have lived in New York City for a little over 8.5 years as of this recording, and I'm from the rural Midwest. I grew up in Iowa in the countryside, where the nearest town was a 20-minute drive, and that town had 1,000 people. So you'll hear me use a lot of farming and seasonal metaphors when talking about astrology, starting in this very episode. And the fact that I grew up in a farming community is why. So, with that said, let's get into the astrology with a very brief overview of some history and astrological traditions, because there are many astrologies, plural, and I think it's important that anyone who you're learning this practice from is very upfront with situating themselves both in the tradition and also in their practice, what they do, what they bring to it. So, in the ancient world, astronomy and astrology were one and the same. Astronomy explained the technical principles of how the cosmos moved, and then astrology explained what the qualities of those celestial bodies we were observing in the sky were, and how those celestial bodies impacted us. Celestial bodies including fixed stars and asteroids alongside planets. So the practice is fundamentally divinatory in nature. Long before 20th century psychoanalysis inflected the practice with personality typing and sort of reframed it as a self-help taxonomy in popular culture, astrology was used to predict, to anticipate, to react to, and ultimately to interpret the corollary, some would say causal, relationship between the events in the sky and our lives here on Earth. So, how do we get those predictions in the first place? So these predictions are made based on the birth chart of a person, a country, an artistic work, or other event. Anything can have a birth chart. Not just people, but pets, the city you live in, your favorite movie. For everyone listening, though, a birth chart for our intents and purposes is a snapshot of the sky the moment that you, sitting there listening to this, took your first breath. All of the planets are in your birth chart. All of the signs are in it too. If you have never pulled your birth chart, you only need 3 things: your date of birth, your birthplace, and your time of birth. And you can log on to astro.com to make a free account and pull your chart up right now, or download a free astrology app like Time Passages. Feel free to put me on pause if you want to pull your birth chart for reference. I will be here when you get back. So, as we continue, I want to make a quick note that astrology is a field with numerous discrete and unique traditions that each have their own internal logic. Just to name a few, there's Hellenistic, Jyotish, medieval Islamicate, Renaissance, modern. That's just off the top of my head. There isn't one house system or zodiac that is superior to another. It's not that one birth chart in one system is right, quote unquote, and another is wrong. We're not in a schoolyard pissing match, we're all grown, and multiple modalities and traditions get to exist at the same time. And many astrologers, including myself, actually draw from several of these modalities and traditions to inform our own practice. But for our intents and purposes here, the Western astrological tradition that most undergirds my own practice is most often called traditional or Hellenistic astrology. Now, Hellenistic may be a very familiar term to those of you who were history majors in undergrad, but it is a term that denotes the ancient world around the Mediterranean, Greece, Egypt. And so, unsurprisingly, you may then infer that Hellenistic astrology, as it is practiced today, is a reconstructed astrological tradition that largely comes to us out of the Mediterranean, especially Egypt and Greece. No surprise there. So it's interesting because Hellenistic, even in as much as we call it traditional astrology today, some people call it ancient astrology, which always gets under my skin a little bit because there are many astrological traditions that are ancient. Like, let's not prioritize, Greek and Roman history above everything else. But in its own time, Hellenistic astrology was deeply influenced by Babylonian astrology, which is itself the oldest known astrological tradition in the world. It emerged around 2nd millennium BC from what is now called Iraq and parts of Syria and Iran. Hellenistic astrology, which is perhaps most identifiable by its use of the tropical zodiac, alongside its prioritizing of the 7 traditional planets and the use of whole sign house systems, sort of bobbed and weaved its way through Christian colonialism throughout history, as astrology was alternately acceptable in, contemporary societies, and then it would be termed unacceptable by the church. So we owe an extraordinary debt, actually, when we're thinking about Hellenistic astrology and the work that came out of, turn of the millennium, Common Era, like Greece and Egypt. We owe the fact that we today have an idea of what was happening then, that we have those texts in the first place. We owe an extraordinary debt, actually, to Persian and Muslim astrologers of the Middle Ages, because they are the ones who, amidst the Christian colonialism that was happening and the church outlawing all of these different things, they stewarded and developed the astrological tradition in that region. One example, and please forgive me, I am probably going to mispronounce this, would be Abu Mashar al-Baqi, who lived during the 8th and 9th century Common Era, and is probably one of the most influential astrologers of all time. He wrote introductory guides and horoscope how-tos and manuals for professional astrologers. He recorded 55 separate Arabic lots in different books. If you've ever heard of the Lot of Fortune, the Lot of Spirit, the Lot of Eros, that is an intervention and development from medieval Islamic astrologers. It's why we call them Arabic lots. So he wrote all of these different books, and they were widely read in the medieval Islamic world. And then they gradually made their way to Spain and then to the rest of Europe, where they proceeded to be translated into Greek and Latin and were significantly responsible for a then revival of astrology that we now call Renaissance astrology, because it developed in Europe out of the Renaissance period, which itself was due to all of these texts being translated. You see how history is so intertextual. It's impossible to consider one of these practices discretely because they're so threaded across time. The reconstructed Hellenistic revival today, in addition to being due to all the work of astrologers over the centuries and millennia who really stewarded it through oppressive organized religions that would like to have rooted out anything considered to be witchcraft. But the current revival has been very much made possible by the scholars and astrologers at Project Hindsight in the 1990s, and by people like Demetra George and Brennan, who have widely read and taught and popularized that school of thought. So Chris Brennan has a wonderful podcast called the Astrology Podcast, which you may well have heard of, which is probably the largest and most generous source of free astrological knowledge on the internet. It's really incredible. Plus all of the astrologers he's interviewed over the years who themselves are elders in the field. There's just so much wisdom that's been captured in that podcast. That's a really, really rich fount to learn from. So, because my practice is grounded in Hellenistic, I really focus on the seven traditional planets, which is another way of saying all of the planets that are visible to the naked eye: the Sun, Earth's moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The moon, we know, is not technically a planet. It's one of Earth's, or not one of, it's the only satellite planet that Earth has, but it gets to be grouped in. So why only those seven and not the others that we know of? And that is because Hellenistic astrologers in ancient Greece, like way back in the day, developed a theory of the cosmos based on the planet that we could see and chart in the sky. So while we now know that there are planets further away from us here on Earth, Uranus, Neptune, dwarf planet Pluto, in this tradition, when we're considering the planet's impact on an individual's daily life, we primarily work with the planets whose cycles were observable and thus recordable to the ancients. Those outer planets also, I should say, they're so far from Earth, and while they do have important cycles and lessons, those blips, as it were, in the radar tend to appear on a more generational or world stage than in an individual life. When Pluto is currently in Aquarius, it's going to take 20 years to move through Aquarius. That is a much slower roll than the moon, which moves through every single sign and every single part of your chart in a single month. You know, there's a difference between the impact that those two things are having. The planets, however, are all connected to different aspects of human life. And so the sun has to do with your vitality, with your life force, your sense of core purpose. And the sun is in charge of the sign Leo, which is so much about courage and warmth and vibrancy and shining brightly so that our light may encourage other people. The moon has to do with our emotional life and also our physical body. The moon is in charge of Cancer, which is a sign that has to do with caretaking, with the protection of what we care about and who we care for. Mercury is where we look for information about your intellect and communication style. Mercury loves to be in, which is to say, it rules, information gathering Gemini and analytical Virgo. Venus is the artist and the lover who governs our relationships with other people, but also with desire itself. And Venus rules lush, sensual Taurus, as well as cultured, harmony-oriented Libra. Mars is where we go for information about how we handle conflict, but also for our courage, our physical movement, how we assert ourselves in life, and just our work ethic in general, as well as our sex drive. Mars rules both the independent, take charge Wonder Woman, that is Aries, as well as the more Black Widow-esque strategic Scorpio. Jupiter expands whatever he touches. And the big gas giant in the sky, we know this. Jupiter's the largest planet that in our solar system. And he is here to make stuff bigger. And he also has a lot to do with healing, with faith, with belief, with teaching, and with life's big picture questions. And Jupiter rules both philosophical Sagittarius as well as more spiritually oriented Pisces. And then Saturn, who is also called Father Time, is the keeper of boundaries. Quite literally, Saturn is the most distant planet that we can still barely see in the sky, and so it really exists as the visible boundary between what we can see, touch, hear, smell, observe, and what is unknown, and those planets and celestial bodies that are beyond. So this is also where we find restriction, responsibility, but it's also where we come to maturity. You know, Saturn is a dyke daddy as much as she is a wise grandparent. And Saturn is in charge of the signs that really have to do with longevity and legacy and world building and things that stand the test of time. And those are Capricorn and Aquarius. So, looking at the planets and the signs they are respectively in charge of tells us a lot about their nature. It also suggests that a planet is going to behave differently depending on the sign that it's in. So, you can imagine that Saturn might approach boundaries very differently if it is in mountain climbing Capricorn versus swimming in the ocean, we are all one, super spiritual Pisces. How do we figure out then what the signs mean as they apply to us? How do we start to put the puzzle pieces together of how our planets work in the sign that they're in, right? Virtually no one is going to have every planet in a sign that it rules. And that means that we are going to have to understand something about how the planets work and then how the signs work in order to understand how a planet is going to behave in a particular sign, embodying a particular archetype. So we can approach learning this through a few ways, none of which has to do with the rote memorization of keywords. We are not doing that No Child Left Behind shit. So first, we can consider the classical element of a sign, which may be familiar to you already. And then my personal favorite way to teach the signs is by their season. Please note that I live in New York City. I grew up in farm country, Iowa, and so am consequently based in the Northern Hemisphere. So the way that I describe the seasons and their correlating signs is going to be different if you are in the Southern Hemisphere, right? Because we learned this in like high school, middle school, whatever, that the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere experience opposite seasons. And that then correlates to having different interpretations in some ways of what the signs are. So if you would like to learn about the signs through a Southern Hemisphere astrologer's perspective, I heartily recommend Kelly Surtees, who is Australian, and I'll have a link to her work in the show notes. So all the adjectives we see associated with the signs ultimately come from how the signs themselves are archetypes that have a ruling planet, as we've discussed, and that can ultimately put us back in conversation with nature. Like, I don't have to memorize adjectives for what Aries means in order to understand that it is that ember of flame that kickstarts spring, you know? The excitement in the air when the leaves start to when the excitement in the air when the leaves start to bud, that first warm day. Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, and so the first sign of spring here in the Northern Hemisphere. It is fire that initiates. It's the first person who carries the Olympic torch. And we remember that Aries is ruled by Mars, which gives that fire a very independent fighting edge to it, right? So if we can understand and put into our own words what that initiatory fire feels like for us individually, then we have a sense of what Aries energy is. So let's bring it back to basics and really drill down. There are fire signs, earth signs, air signs, and water signs. Those are the four classical Western elements. And there are three signs in each of those elemental buckets. So fire, which we've already started talking about with Aries, is illuminating. It's commanding, right? It's not always a big flame either. This isn't always a bonfire. Sometimes it's the embers left in a fireplace after a long night. This could be a hearth. It could be a wildfire. There's a lot of ways to think about that. And then the fire signs are Aries, which we've discussed, as well as Leo, which is ruled by the hot and steady sun, and Sagittarius, which is ruled by Jupiter, which teaches and disseminates philosophy through fiery lectures and sermons. Moving on to Earth, that is a physically tangible element. And like we're going to, within the elements, we're going to just acknowledge that we live on Earth. Everything is technically of Earth. So when we think about Earth as an element, what we're thinking about is the ground beneath our feet, what we can see, hear, touch, taste, smell. It's really matter of fact. It's connected to what we build with, what we make things out of. Earth is there when someone's being birthed, and Earth is there composting the body after we are gone, right? And so the Earth signs are Taurus, which is ruled by abundant Venus, Virgo, which is the distilling, analytical side of communicator Mercury, and Capricorn, which is the mountain that Saturn puts in front of us to climb and then to develop and grow through. Air is a very different element. Air is where potentiality lives. It is our breath, our speech, our conversations, our connections to other people. But it's also symbolically representative of our thought life, of our dreams, of all of the wishes that are not spoken. In this, air has a duality, right? Earth is always steady, it's always here, it's always in our present. And then fire is very temporal. It blazes, it burns out, it needs to be fed. Air is both always here and always on the horizon. It's it's an element that really transcends time and that really helps us to continue to move forward. The air signs are Gemini, which is the curious side of Mercury, as mentioned, Libra, which is ruled by relationship oriented Venus, and Aquarius, which is ruled by Saturn in that way that we have to learn what the underlying, like intellectual structures, ideas, rules are in order to break them. Finally, last but not least, water. Water is the element that needs a container, okay? A river needs a riverbed. But also, water is really nourishing. Our bodies are mostly water. We need water to live. We can go a lot longer without food than we can without water. It's the thing that both sustains life and that also provides connections between all living things. And symbolically speaking, water is representative of our emotions, our spiritual lives, and those connections with those in the world around us. The water signs are Cancer, which is ruled by the moon, Scorpio, which is ruled by Mars in his capacity as strategist, and Pisces, which is ruled by Jupiter in that way that belief and collective effervescence can reach across every boundary and really bring people together for a common cause. Considering the ways in which the elements themselves interact in the natural world, are part of the natural world, show up in the natural world, right, is our first clue to thinking about what the signs themselves are symbolic of. So to elements, we then add the next essential ingredient, which is the modalities. And so in addition to being organized by element, fire, earth, air, water, we are also going to organize the signs by modality, which is to say how they do that element. This will make sense in a minute. And the modalities are cardinal, fixed, and mutable. There are 4 signs that belong to each of those categories. So once again, my favorite way to teach modality is through the metaphor of seasonality. So the cardinal signs may be easier to remember in this capacity since they all begin on equinoxes and solstices. The cardinal signs all are the start of spring, summer, fall, winter. So this is to say that spring, which begins on the spring equinox, is also when Aries season starts. Cancer kicks us off into summer with the summer solstice. Libra takes us into fall with the autumnal equinox, and then Capricorn season always begins on the winter solstice, which is, of course, the first sign of winter. These signs initiate us into new experiences, into new seasons, both literally and metaphorically. And so we look to these signs and where they are in our charts and any planets that may be in them for information about leading, about starting new things. In the middle sign of every season, the weather stabilizes, as much as is possible with climate change anyway, and we settle into the depth of an elemental experience that really embodies that season. So these are the fixed signs. We can think of Leo, which is the middle sign of summer when the heat is at its hottest and it's pure and unadulterated and an intense expression of fire. It's not the start of a fiery episode like Aries. It's not a transitioning wildfire, which we'll get into next, like Sagittarius. Leo is stable. It is warm. It is the hearth that brings people together. And the same can be said of all fixed signs. Taurus stabilizes the planting season in the middle of spring. It is often heralded for its manifesting abilities. Scorpio gets associated with so much that it doesn't deserve, but as the middle sign of autumn or fall, it is the dying season. It's where we see decay. The leaves are changing, the leaves are falling, and Scorpio is a really reflective time when we consider what has been harvested and what we are going to take with us into the winter. And then Aquarius is that middle sign of winter, the icy breath, the snow-capped peaks of the mountain, where we are, again, deeply contemplative, but not only on an individual level, also on a communal level. These are the ideas that we are chewing on when it feels more like there is time to think. Finally, again, last but not least, the mutable signs embrace the power of transition. Someone has to bring the change, and it might as well be them. Like, very Mrs. Peacock from the movie Clue, you know? Someone has to break the ice, and it might as well be me. That is a mutable sign. So here we have Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces that are the signs that close out one season and usher us in, like start to usher us into the next one. So Gemini is the gorgeous social breeze that transitions us between spring and summer. Virgo is often associated with organized earthiness, but that's because it's the sign of the harvest, of reaping, of sorting the wheat from the chaff. It transitions us from summer into fall. Sagittarius is the wildfire, the freedom lover. It's often celebrated for its eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die kind of ethos, but that joie de vivre is motivated by the fact that it is the last sign of autumn. Everyone is partying around the fire because they're settling in for the long, melancholy winter. And then Pisces is the last sign of winter, which celebrates our survival through the long nights and those times when resources may have been stretched thin. Pisces really embodies the power of the collective and the healing that comes as we begin to ready for new seasons and new life. This is all to say that when you understand the element of a sign, plus its modality, as well as the planet that's in charge of it, the signs begin to make a lot more sense. This also explains why different signs work differently with different planets. I hope that this brief explainer has helped to lay down some groundwork for you and help you feel more confident in reflecting on your own individual, unique associations and interpretations of the signs and the planets that you have in your chart. If you have any questions or ideas for things that you're curious to hear me talk about in future episodes, you can leave a message at Call Your Coven on Instagram, callyourcoven@gmail.com for email. Feel free to send something my way. I am also at Jeanna Kadlec, JeannaKadlec, on every social media platform, and my newsletter, Astrology for Writers, is on Substack. I hope this has been helpful. I'll see you soon.